Next, from the Union League Club of Chicago, former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld talks about his book, Known and Unknown, which recounts his early life in Chicago and how his career led him to Congress and later to become the youngest man to ever serve as Secretary of Defense. And then still later, under George Bush, he was the oldest man to hold that position. Secretary Rumsfeld is interviewed by veteran Chicago television journalist Bill Kurtis. This runs about 50 minutes.
Donald Rumsfeld was the 13th and 21st Secretary of Defense, as you know. He served under 7 presidents as a U.S. Congressman, U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, White House Chief of Staff, Presidential Envoy to the Middle East, Chairman of the Space Commission, and in several other public service positions as well as President, Chairman, and CEO of 2 major U.S. corporations. He currently chairs the Rumsfeld Foundation, which supports leadership and public service at home and the growth of free political and free economic systems abroad. He and his wife, Joyce, are here today, and his daughter, Marcy. You might just raise your hand and let everybody say hello to you. Mr. Rumsfeld has 3 children, and they live in New Mexico right now, and I'd like you to welcome Donald Rumsfeld.
Welcome to the mayor debates, our latest candidate for mayor of Chicago. No, that would be too hard, he said earlier. He'd like to pass on that one. Don and I are friends. We go back a number of years, served on a board or 2 together. And we will talk about an 850-page book, a remarkable book about a remarkable man and certainly a remarkable career. First of all, Don, I'd like to get a couple of questions out of the way, if I can. I'm sure they're on your mind. Where is Osama bin Laden?
That's vicious. He is having trouble communicating. He's having trouble traveling. I hope he's having trouble recruiting. I hope he's having trouble raising money. And I hope somebody in the world finds him.
We have plenty of people looking, don't we? Can everybody hear okay back there? Good. Second question, I wanted to do a documentary before our latest 10-year war, and it was on the weapons of mass destruction. And I had this feeling that they were somewhere in the Middle East. Nuclear weapons had been sold, and I put a researcher, a wonderful producer, and she came back and she said, look, everybody I talk to say that there are none, even in Iraq. I was so upset, I dismissed her and went elsewhere, and then all of a sudden, war broke out, looking for weapons of mass destruction. Were you surprised when none were found in Iraq?
Yes. The intelligence community in the United States spent a great deal of time working with the UN inspectors and working with the intelligence organizations of France and Germany and the United Kingdom. And they came to a unanimous conclusion that the evidence suggested that, not that Iraq had nuclear weapons, but that they had weapons of mass destruction, meaning chemical and biological weapons. We know that Saddam Hussein had used them against Iran. We know Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against his own people, the Kurds and Shia. And the conviction on the part of his neighbors was real. I remember meeting with Mubarak, President Mubarak of Egypt, and he said, you can be absolutely certain that Saddam Hussein will use chemical weapons against U.S. forces, coalition forces, the closer you get to Baghdad. And that was the conviction all across the region. Now, why was that? Well, we know we had large supplies of chemical and biological weapons. And we know that the United Nations was trying to find out if he's disposed of them. And after the war, we know that, in fact, he still had the people who developed them, and they had the materials they need to rapidly increase them. But for whatever reason, he made a decision to try to persuade the world that he had large supplies, which in fact, it turns out he did not. Up at Kermal, the coalition forces went in there after the war started, and there was a deep underground chemical facility where they found traces of ricin and potassium chloride. They found chemical protective suits, and they found in Arabic a lot of documents that described exactly how one made chemical and biological weapons. The conviction was so deep on the part of the coalition forces and the president, and we all heard Colin Powell's speech at the United Nations. I mean, here's a man who dealt with intelligence materials all of his adult life, probably had more background and experience than anyone, and he made his presentation to the United Nations and the world on behalf of the country with absolute conviction that what he was saying was correct. So I look back on it, and we'll never know exactly what was in Saddam Hussein's mind, why he wanted to behave the way he behaved. He was given a chance to leave the country by President Bush because, goodness knows, war is everybody's absolute last choice. It's such a terrible thing, and the loss of life and those that are wounded, each one's a personal tragedy, and you can't help but have that weigh on a president and a secretary of defense and people involved in the conflict every day of their lives. But there was absolute conviction on the part of everybody, and any suggestion to the contrary, I think, was unfortunate.
There's a feeling that if we had gone into Afghanistan and gotten out early, it would have been fine. We would have done what we wanted to do. Why did we go to Iraq, and when did you learn we were going to?
Could I first just say thank you to everyone for coming? You know, and I'll come back to that, and I'm happy to answer it. But I was downstairs earlier and had a chance to shake hands with a lot of folks. But I look around this room and I see so many friends and people who helped in my campaigns for Congress, and I just wish there were more time and I could thank each one of you personally, and I do appreciate your all being here. I remember one time, one of my first coffee clatches was in Skokie, and there was a little room, little living room, you know, not 2-3 times the size of this dais. And I started to give my little pitch. I'd do 6 or 8 or 10 of these. I was 29 years old. It was 50 years ago. And I looked down in front, and there was a guy sitting there, a gangly guy with his legs crossed, and it was Bob Galvin. And I just looked down here, and there's Bob Galvin. His legs are not crossed, but I mean, that's the kind of memory that one has from a half a century ago. It's just amazing. Now, what was the question?
Why did we go into Iraq?
That's what I thought you asked. The short answer is this. Iraq had a vicious dictator, a repressive regime. He'd killed hundreds of thousands of people in his own country. He'd used chemical weapons against his neighbors and his own people. He'd violated 17 UN resolutions. He was firing at U.S. aircraft every day, over 2,000 times. From the time I arrived there, almost every day, Iraq was the only country in the world that was firing at U.S. aircraft. U.S. and British aircraft were patrolling the northern and southern no-fly zones for the United Nations that had been established by the United Nations. And I was engaged after 9/11 with the challenges we faced in Afghanistan. And the president asked me to stay after a cabinet meeting or an NSC meeting and took me into the Oval Office, as I describe in the book. And he said, "Do you have a plan for Iraq?" And I said, "I'll find out." And I started a process of reviewing all the war plans that the Department of Defense had, which is a responsibility of a Secretary of Defense. And, some months later, he asked me, what did I find? And I explained to him that the plan that was on the shelf was stale and that it needed to be reworked. And that I'd asked the combatant commander for CENTCOM to do that. And over a period of time, the president would ask for briefings on it, and it was that kind of a process.
Until it seemed like the right thing to do.
Until the president came to the conclusion that Saddam Hussein was not going to comply. The worry is the nexus between weapons of mass destruction, meaning highly lethal weapons, not conventional weapons, but weapons that have a lethality, many multiples of normal weapons, and the problem of terrorist groups and a willingness to use those kinds of weapons. During that period, Johns Hopkins University did a study called Dark Winter. And in that study, it was conducted by a group of people from the Clinton administration who'd been in government and were knowledgeable. And the study indicated that if smallpox were put in 3 places in the United States, in a relatively short period of months, you would end up with something between 800,000 and 1 million deaths in the United States. And now, if you think of what that would mean, it would mean that you would inevitably have, in effect, martial law in the country. You'd have governors not wanting people to move from state to state because of contamination and dangers. So there was the reality of September 11th and 3,000 innocent men, women, and children killed. There was the fact that the intelligence community, as they say, was blinking red with threats from around the world. And there was the awareness that if you married terrorist organizations with weapons of mass destruction, that the damage could be many multiples of what occurred on September 11th. So that was the backdrop. I remember right after September 11th going into Oman and meeting with the Sultan and Qaboos of Oman. And he was out visiting with his people in a tent, and it must have been 150 degrees in that tent, and 2 or 3 of us were there, and we sat down with him, and he said a startling thing to me. He said, you know, September 11th may be a blessing in disguise. It may be the thing that wakes up the world to the danger of mixing weapons of mass destruction with terrorists, which is a real threat and danger to the world, and the world might be able to behave and conduct themselves in a way that they can prevent that kind of thing from occurring. If you think about it, here we are almost a decade later, and we have not had another attack on the United States, which is, I don't think many people 10 years ago would have speculated that that would be possible.
That's an applause line. There is a feeling, and because you had imminent threats there and the potential of nuclear weapons, you believed you had to go in fast, and it was a triumph for our military forces, the invasion of Baghdad. However, once you got there, there was a critical feeling that there was no plan for the peace. Is that true?
No. The Department of Defense, the Department of State, the National Security Council had extensive discussions about the period of post-major combat operations in Iraq as well as in Afghanistan. In fact, one of the things that a combatant command's plan includes is a Phase 1, a Phase 2, a Phase 3, and a Phase 4. Phase 4 is the post-combat, major combat operations plan. I don't know who said it, maybe some brilliant military strategist said, war is a series of catastrophes followed by victory. The enemy has a brain, they watch what happens, and Eisenhower put it well. Eisenhower said that a plan is nothing, planning is everything. The point being that the minute the first forces hit the ground, the enemy starts reacting, and whatever you've planned has to be adapted, because for every offense there's a defense, for every defense there's an offense, and it's a constant adjustment that has to take place. We had planned for literally dozens, the executive branch of the federal government had planned for dozens of different contingencies. A number of those contingencies didn't occur. A great deal of thought went into what if Saddam Hussein engaged in something approximating Fortress Baghdad. and ended up with a Stalingrad type situation where the only way you could deal with the regime and actually change the regime would have been the risk of collateral damage and civilians involved, and it would have been a terrible thing. We were deeply concerned about the possibility that you'd end up with enormous environmental damage, because when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, there were many, many oil fields that were damaged, and it was a serious problem. There was concern that all the bridges would be taken down. A thing that was not anticipated was that he would release over 100,000 prisoners from his prisons. As the United States and the coalition forces came in from the south, that was not anticipated. So you ended up with 100,000 bad guys floating around the country. A second thing that wasn't anticipated, the plan, General Frank's plan, was to come in from the south, but also to come in from the north through Turkey. And Turkey is a NATO ally. There was every expectation that Turkey would approve the access through Turkey of a division to go into Iraq from the north, where the Sunni stronghold was, Tikrit and Saddam Hussein's Sunni compatriots. At the last minute, the Turkish government, we got a majority of the vote, but it had to be a majority of the entire parliament, not a majority of those present, and it fell 2 or 3 votes short, and the Turkish parliament prevented Franks from bringing forces in from the north. The result was that the battles took place in the south. It took time to get a division up from the south all the way to the north, and a good many of the Sunni leadership in military leadership escaped. So the first part of the insurgency was really a return to power of the Sunnis. That not a foreign insurgency and not a criminal insurgency and not a Shia insurgency, but a bunch of Sunnis who didn't want to lose power. So you combine that, and then you add into the call that Saddam Hussein made for jihad to bring people in from all across the Arab world. They started streaming in from Iran and from Syria, and you ended up migrating from initially a Sunni insurgency to a broad anti-coalition insurgency. So the plan had to keep being adjusted as things went along.
If you had it to do again, would you go in with more troops?
Might. General Franks, I talked to about it. We had 450,000 troops ready to go in. His plan was to bring in as many of those as were needed. The major combat operations were dealt with a relatively small number of troops, and successfully. Saddam Hussein's army was very large, but it was basically Shia conscripts that didn't want to be there, and I think something like 1,500 Sunni generals. The Sunni were in charge of the country, and they were the minority. So the war starts, and a lot of the people in the Iraqi army, the Shia conscripts, left. They just went home and didn't want to be there.
Just looking at mistakes, was it a mistake for Bremer to dissolve the army?
I think you can't blame Bremer for that. I talk about it in the book a good deal. The 2 big decisions that have been criticized, one was the dissolution of the Iraqi army, the other was what's called the de-Baathification process, kind of like the denazification process in Germany. So you had the Sunnis. I'll take the de-Baathification first because I think they're both important questions. The Sunnis were in charge of that country, and to be a school teacher, you had to be a Sunni. To run a power plant, you had to be a Baathist, excuse me. You didn't have to be a Sunni. You're either a Sunni or you aren't a Sunni. So the process was put in place by the Coalition Provisional Authority, as it should be, and it affected a relatively small number of people that were prohibited under the de-Baathification law from serving in major positions. How it was administered, I think, was the problem, not the decision to have a de-Baathification process. I think that was the right decision. How it was administered by a man named Ahmed Chalabi, was a Shia, was probably had the effect of making a lot of Sunnis feel that they really weren't going to be part of the new Iraq. And you can't have that. You've got to have people feeling that they can have a stake in the future of their country. So that issue, I think people tend to go either it was a good decision or a bad decision. I think that's not the way to look at it. I think it was the right decision, and eventually the Coalition Provisional Authority in Bremer took Chalabi out and had it administered in a more moderate way. On the disbanding of the Army, I think it really kind of disbanded itself. When the war started, the Shia didn't want to be there, and a lot of them just went home. And it's true that the Coalition Provisional Authority decided to disband it. The difficulty was that the CPA had trouble paying all of these people who had been in the Army, went home, and finding a way to pay them in the aftermath of a major conflict and a regime change. There's disorder inevitably, and so you ended up with a lot of young men, some with weapons, wandering around the country. And eminently recruitable. You could talk them into joining some jihad against the coalition. They then fairly rapidly began bringing them back into the Army, reconstituting it, and we had General Petraeus there during that period, training and equipping the Iraqi Army, and by the time you got to 2006, the Iraqi Army had a very large number of people that were able to work closely with our forces, which is one of the reasons the surge worked so well. But I think you can't say it was a good decision or a bad decision in either one of those. And I think, people kind of like to point to one thing and say that's the problem. I think in each case, there are gradations of how they were done that really was what was at stake.
As we saw, the problems of political parties trying to work together and being unable to. I always thought Mayor Daley would be good over there. We should just send him over, and he could settle it all. And
one time, Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, came to me and he said, "I've got a warlord that's not doing what I want, and I want your permission for me to tell him that if he doesn't do what I need to have him to do, which is terribly harmful to our government." That we're going to use the U.S. military power to make him do what we want him to do. I said, "Whoa, wait a minute. It's not clear to me. I think someone else ought to be throwing around the United States military power at their whim and discretion." I said, "Let me talk to some folks back home." So I had talked to the president. I talked to the National Security Council. We had an extensive discussion. And the result was the president agreed with me, and I went back to President Karzai and I said, "Look, here's the drill. You're president of this country. You've now got your own constitution. This fellow's not doing what you want." Now, in Chicago, the way it works, this is a true story. I said, in Chicago, if some guy isn't doing what the mayor wants, well, the potholes don't get fixed. He doesn't get patronage, and he finds it's not a very pleasant situation. And if he does do what you want, the potholes do get fixed. There is patronage, and things work out one whale of a lot better. Now, at some point, the United States of America is not going to be in Afghanistan. And you do not want to look like you're a puppet of the United States of America. You do not want to be without your own capabilities and your own resources. You're simply going to have to be more like Mayor Daley.
I want to get to what you learned growing up here in Chicago that helped you in your career. But now might be a good time to talk a little bit about the book. A remarkable book, over 800 pages, but we've come to an electronic world so that if you're reading it on ebooks, some Kindle kind of product, we understand that you can go to a footnote, press the footnote, and it will take you automatically to the historic document that you used as the basis for the book. Am I right?
That's true. I don't know that it's ever been done quite like this. We created a website where I had a wonderful archive from 78 years of living, and we digitized a lot of it. And what we did was we talked to the ebook people, and they now have an arrangement where you can read the book. It's not the footnote. The footnotes are text. It's the endnotes. You can then see an endnote, go to the endnote in the book, and in the book I may quote a paragraph of a memo that I wrote 10 years ago. Then you go directly from that end note to the full memo, and you can see right there the context of what that paragraph was, who the memo went to, what the leading and closing paragraphs were. I don't know that this has been done before, but there are something like 1,360 endnotes in this book. The website now has literally hundreds of documents, many of them primary source documents that have never been public. And that means thousands of pages of documents, so people that are interested in history, interested in understanding how decisions are made, what it looks like on the inside of government, can do that. They can actually go to the website separately and have an opportunity to, and I put these documents on there, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly. There's a lot of them that's misspelling because it's not like a diary, it's not like a journal. It is simply working documents that were in my archive that I could then put on this website, have someone digitize them, and they're there for everyone to see. And what I wanted to do, you know, a lot of books that get written about historical events are written by people who never were there. They were journalists or somebody on the outside looking at it, and they talk to some people and write it. What I wanted to do, since I had this wonderful opportunity in my life to be involved in so many different types of public service, was to write a book that people could go to and check to see what actually happened, and then look at the documents and make their own judgment about it.
Joyce, did he write it at an office at home?
I didn't even write it, I dictated. My handwriting's so bad that I use, this is a little embarrassing, I use a dictaphone, and it's got that little tape that goes around in it. It isn't even digital. And I shouldn't even have said that. But they say confession's good for the soul. And then what I did was I put together a team of people, of 6, 7 people in my office. You know, all of them, most of them under 26 years old, smarter than blazes, embarrassingly smart. And then we started bringing people in from my life to the office, and we'd tape the discussion. Someone would say something and stimulate it, and we'd go back and forth and discuss it, and each reminding the other of things. Then I'd go to the archive, and it took 4 years to do this. And then we'd transcribe these discussions and then fashion a chapter about my time at Searle or at General Instrument or as Middle East envoy or NATO. And fortunately, I've lived so long that they now have declassified a good portion of the things. When I was ambassador to NATO, it's already 25 or 30 years ago. And Middle East envoys 25 years ago. So a lot of it's available now.
Let's talk about your business career for a moment. Certainly here we have a personage who is part of history, a big event in all our lives. And you did have your CEO days and running for office and being elected here in Chicago. But we have many of the business giants in this room. When the president asked you to become Secretary of Defense, there was a mission. And the mission was to restructure the military-industrial complex, which is a little harder than than Motorola, Bob Galvin, I would think. What happened?
People said I came in with the idea that I should transform the Department of Defense. In fact, it was not my idea. President Bush ran for public office on that platform. He gave a speech at the Citadel. He told the American people, I want your vote, and one of the things I want to do is to transform the Department of Defense. So that was my charge, and I think it was an important one. If you think about it, these are the first wars of the 21st century. They're the first wars of the information age. They're totally different in many respects from previous conflicts. In World War II, there was no television. In the Korean War, there was barely any television. In Vietnam War, there was television. But in this war, there was, video cameras and emails and all of these Facebooks and Twitters and all of these things that exist today that change the nature of it. So I went in with that charge, and I set about it. And as everyone here in this room knows, change is hard. People get comfortable with what the way things are. And if you change something, someone's not going to like it. And if you change two things, more than one person's not going to like it. And if you keep going, pretty soon it accumulates. What we were able to do, someone said, you know, when 9/11 occurred, there goes the transformation agenda. In fact, just the reverse was the case. It provided impetus. We were able to dramatically increase the number of special forces and their equipment and their authorities. And today, if you think about the kind of conflicts we're dealing with and will be dealing with in the future, we're not dealing with big armies, navies, or air forces. The special forces are so critical to our success today. And the fact that over the past period they've been dramatically strengthened is terribly important. Second, the number of unmanned aerial vehicles today have been just many multiples of what they were in 2001 when President Bush went in. Third, how do you say this? If you think of the old divisions in the Army, they were proud. There were songs, there were pennants, there were history books about them. And they had, in the retired military, they had proud histories. They didn't fit the 21st century. And so, thanks to General Pete Schoonmaker, we were able to move from a division structure to smaller combat brigades that have the ability to be, in many instances, interchangeable, and the capability of the United States Army today is vastly greater than it had been. These things are hard to do. They're important. There's enormous resistance when you do it. And the last thing I would say is when I arrived there in 2001, the force structure of the United States around the world, our posture, where we were located, was basically a leftover from World War II and the Korean War. We still had large forces in Germany, prepared for a tank attack from the Soviet Union that didn't exist anymore. We had forces in the Korean Peninsula, large numbers, in a country that had once been poor and in trouble. And by the time I arrived there, it had the 10th or 12th largest GDP in the face of the earth, this half of the Korean Peninsula. So what we did was we began readjusting our forces around so that they were in the right places. They would best serve our national interests, where they were in countries that wanted them, where they were in countries where they were not allowing that country to be dependent on us, but causing those countries to step up and fulfill their own defense responsibilities, where they were in countries where their parliaments wouldn't prevent us from using the forces to our advantage, and the significant troop changes are just are breathtaking. I mean, but hard. For example, we were spending $236 million to support air forces in Iceland to defend against Soviet bombers in the year 2000. Of course, the Soviet Union didn't exist. $236 million a year is not nothing. It took me 4 years to get them out of Iceland. Everyone was against it. They wanted to keep them there. Why? Well, basically, they were doing search and rescue for Icelander fishermen. So I can understand why Icelanders wanted them there. But my attitude was we could spend that $236 million elsewhere to better advantage for the American people. It took 4 years. That's almost $1 billion down the drain while we were trying to overcome the resistance from Iceland, the resistance from other countries in NATO, the resistance from the Department of State. So everything you do in government against the Iron Triangle being the defense contractors, the bureaucracy in the Department of Defense, and the semi-permanent Congress, those three things arrange things in our country in a way that it's very tough to alter. But we made great progress.
We're nearing the end, but we are going to squeeze out 2 questions. I'll ask one final question, and then we'll come to the room, but you'll have to please stand and raise your hand and compete for that slot.
Before you do that, could I just say one thing? I served in so many different roles, but to be able to serve with the men and women in uniform, these volunteers who are they're dedicated, they're patriotic, and they're proud of their service. And you can't help but just feel gratified to know them. The proceeds from this book that we receive, not the publisher's proceeds, but our proceeds, are going to go to the troops and their families who also serve, to the children of those who are fallen and died. And it seems to me that it is important that people recognize the value in our country of an all-volunteer military, of people who want to serve, who decide they're going to do that, and are proud of their service. And that is, in fact, how blessed we are that we've moved from a compulsory system to a voluntary military.
So the proceeds of the book will go to your foundation, and then you'll administer?
I assume it'll go through my foundation, but it's going to go to the charities that our foundation has been supporting, like Paws for Patriot, the dogs, and the Fisher House, and all the rehabilitation and the mentoring programs, and all of these different charities that we've been supporting separately. The proceeds will all go to those kinds of charities.
Mm-hmm. My final question, which isn't exactly an upper, but I think that we should deal with it, is Abu Ghraib. It's got to be one of the low points for you.
Oh my goodness! You know, you're doing your job, and someone comes to you and, excuse me, and says, there's been an announcement out of Baghdad that there's an investigation going on for the abuse of some of the detainees. And it's like one more piece of information among 100 pieces of information that come to you on any given day. So the military discovered this. They made an announcement in Baghdad that there had been some abuse. They've decided they're going to investigate it. It wasn't investigative journalism or anything else. It was just that. They found out about it, and they said they were going to investigate it. They made a press announcement, and someone told me. I don't know what it was, a month later, 2 months later. All of the information in the investigation, obviously, is sensitive, so the investigators keep it secret because they don't want to compromise their ability to prosecute anybody who had done something that was against the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And I get told, as the President does, and anyone in the chain of command, look, do not utter a word about this because you'll be accused of command influence. If you act judgmental about it, you're going to be accused of command influence, and the defendants who did the abuse are going to use that in their defense, and they might get off. And then out of the blue come these photographs. Just heartbreaking. It's like you've been punched in the stomach, and you think to yourself, here are these wonderful, wonderful young men and women in our service, and their reputations are stained by the people who abused those people that were in our custody. And it was obviously disgraceful, it was perverted, it was disgusting, it was heartbreaking, and I just was sick about it. What you do then is you're in the military organization and you look for accountability. If a ship runs aground, it's the skipper's fault. So you start looking at the chain of command, and unfortunately the chain of command was confused in this sense. The people who'd been there and been responsible for training and equipping had gone. Some had retired, and I'd replaced some. The people who were there had been there a relatively short period of time. You look up the operational chain and the administrative chain, and you had the same problem. Some people had just gotten there, and some people had just gone. Then you look at the person who was the logical person, and it turns out he had been badly staffed by the Army and by the Joint Staff, and I felt that firing him was not fair. It just didn't feel right. He was a junior officer in charge of the entire country. And he had a staff that, as I recall, was something less than 60% staffed, which was inexcusable. And I just felt that I didn't want, the president said to me, someone's head's got to roll. And he asked about a couple of people, and I said, no, you got the wrong guy, the wrong guy. Finally, I gave him, within a few days, I gave him my resignation and said, look, it comes right back to me. And I think it's a terrible thing that's happened. It's harmful to the country. It encourages terrorists to be able to go out and recruit against us. It makes the Iraqi people wonder what kind of a country we are. So I submitted my resignation. He rejected it the next day. 3 days later, I submitted it again and told him I thought that was a mistake, and in fact, I should leave. Somebody's head ought to roll because it was so damaging, and I thought the country and the military and the department would be better off if it were seen that this country cares about that. He thought about it for a day or two and rejected it again and asked me please not to do that. I personally, in retrospect, think it would have been the right thing to do and that I was right and he was wrong.
I don't think you were right. 2 questions. First, right there, sir.
Away from politics for a little bit, getting a little more personal. Can you talk about strategic thinking and leadership with regard to managerial styles? You've obviously effectively done it in such a great performance. How have you been able to codify that and use that, such as when you fulfilled the role of Pentagon?
The short answer is imperfectly. I have watched talented people in so many walks of life in my 78 years, and when I've seen something that struck me, I've made a note of it, and I've written it down. And I've got a collection of these things that when I was Chief of Staff for President Ford, he said to me, he didn't have a campaign staff, he'd never run for president or vice president, and I showed him what I called Rumsfeld's rules that I'd collected over the years. And he said, let's send it to the staff so that they'll see, because he said, I agree with those things. So I prepared them, and I've kept them over the years and expanded them and refined them. And what they are simply is, we were talking earlier, you know, in business, one of the rules I've found is that what you measure improves. And that means, that's complicated. It means you've got to decide priorities. What is it you think is important that's going to move that company forward? And decide that you're going to measure progress on that, and you're going to report on progress on that, and everyone in the organization knows you're going to be asking them about it. And inevitably, what happens is what you measure improves. In the military, we say it differently. We say you get what you inspect, not what you expect. And it's those kinds of things that I have found helpful. And if you want, I'll send you a copy of Rumsfeld's rules.
No, they're in the book. Buy the book. Anybody over here? Question? Yes, sir.
Judge Duff, there's a mic. Dangerous giving Brian Duff a mic, I'll tell you.
Don, I'm interested in the fact that I know you, I think, very well, and your mind functions in a variety of ways at the same time. I'm serious, and I think that the goal is the final answer. Have you considered, with all of the experience you have that's accumulated in your imagination, in your rationality, in your energy, that you can take a look at our grandchildren and think about what is the world going to be like and what goals should we assert now to make it a better place?
Oh boy. You know, we all think about that, and I remember being in Congress when we had the first $100 billion budget in Lyndon Baines Johnson's presidency, and the country took a collective gasp at $100 billion budget and think today where we are. The trillions of dollars in the deficit and the budget. And when you mention grandchildren, that's what leaps to mind. You think of how in the world can we, in our time, behave in a way that keeps the opportunity that exists in this country for the next generation and the generation after that, because that's what we've all benefited from. People are lined up all across the world to try to come to the United States of America. Why? Because it's you know, you give it the gate test. You lift up the gate and see which way people are moving. And they're doing it for a reason. And they're coming here because this is such an amazing country. And the opportunity is so wonderful because of free political and free economic systems. And you look at the dangers that we face today because of debt and because of the spending levels and the adverse effect that that can have on the future generations. You know, we can manage it during our time, and the danger is incremental. It's not immediately catastrophic in any sense, but the cumulative effect of it is we've got to recognize that it's the private sector in this country that creates the jobs, creates the products, creates the innovation, and we have to create an environment that's hospitable to that. And the best thing we can do for our grandchildren, Brian, it seems to me, is to get up every morning and see if we can't contribute to the freer political and the freer economic system that creates that wonderful opportunity for all of us.
Ladies and gentlemen, Don Rumsfeld.
Ladies and gentlemen.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.